Welcome to episode 4 of Refactoring with Bob. I am, as always, Bob. And today we kind of have a special treat. A colleague of mine has asked me to review some code that he wrote. So instead of looking at stuff that I just made up, we're going to look at something that somebody else just made up. A couple things to note about today's project. This is a quick and dirty homebrew content management system. And so it was written with the intent of getting done as quickly as possible, not necessarily following best practices. Also, this was a learning exercise, and so we're just going to keep that in mind as we look through the code. And before we start, I just want to acknowledge and thank my colleague for allowing me to share this and to critique it, not only to critique it, but to critique it in public, which takes a lot of courage. And so I tip my imaginary hat to you, sir. So let's get started. All right, so here we are in the project. This is a .NET Core MVC application, and just to be upfront, most of the work I do involves full framework MVC, and so there's a good chance I'm going to say a lot of stupid things in this like I usually do, so just give me a little leeway on that. Also, this project uses MySQL instead of SQL Server, which is fine. I'm just not as familiar with MySQL, and so I'm probably not going to touch much on the database structure or any of that stuff. So to get started, I like to check out the startup file first. All right, so let's just start here. We have configuration. This is all kind of boilerplate stuff. MVC is boilerplate. This is custom. This looks like some debugging code that got left behind. And then the rest of this stuff is, I think all of this is just boilerplate, and then we've got a couple controllers being mapped here. So it looks like there's an admin section, and then basically any other things get routed to the content controller. I think I want to start with these services though. So first, super minor thing, we don't actually need the type annotations here. The compiler can just figure that out. You know, if you like them, if you want to be more explicit, that's fine. Let's check out database connection. Okay. So there's a couple things here. First, we have get connection, but it's actually returning a connection string, and so I'm not a huge fan of that. The second thing is obviously we've got a connection string hard-coded into the project, and actually the developer mentioned that he ran into some issues with configuration, and so he just kind of did this to save time and stop messing with it. But I'm going to pull this out, and we're actually going to have this work correctly, I guess. That sounds very rude. So in order to get access to that, we're going to need this I configuration. And this may not be the ideal way to do this in .NET Core, but this is the simplest way that I know of. So I need to bring in that namespace. Let's set this as a private read-only field, and then the connection string. And that connection string is just called connection string. Wow, thank you for that. Cool. And again, I like the syntax, so I'm going to do this. There we go. The last thing is, again, you're not actually getting a connection, you're getting connection string, so I'm going to rename that. All right, now I can't do this anymore. I can't new this up. What I can do is add a singleton of database connection and just let it kind of figure it out, because it should know how to resolve this dependency, and so I don't need to tell, like I don't need to pass in an implementation of that. So database migration depends on database connection. Because we just told MVC how to resolve that, we don't need to explicitly create an instance. We can just tell it we want a singleton, and it will resolve that for us. And then database service looks like it also depends on database connection. We don't need to provide it an instant anymore. We can have it resolve that itself. So that simplifies things, I think, a little bit. But let's take a look at the database migration. All right, looking at this database migration class, the first thing I notice is in the constructor, we get a copy of the connection string, and then we call upgrade. And I'm guessing upgrade is doing some work, and looks like it is. So it's actually connecting to the database, it's executing some SQL, and I'm going to say we should not be doing that inside a constructor. And the reason for that is that, as a best practice, constructors are really only meant to initialize state, and they really shouldn't be doing work, and they shouldn't be throwing exceptions, with the exception of, like, argument null or that kind of stuff. If you pass it invalid data, then it throws exceptions, but it shouldn't be throwing exceptions because the network is down. There's a number of reasons for that. One of them that I've experienced personally is that sometimes the constructor gets run at times when you're not expecting it, especially if you're using dependency injection. So we had sites that were initializing things during sort of the site boot up phase, and the constructors were throwing exceptions, but our logging system hadn't actually completed because that was part, or hadn't completed initializing because that's part of the inversion of control. And so these constructors were throwing exceptions, they weren't getting logged anywhere, and it became very hard to track down what the problem was. But if we had done the work in a method at some point after the class had been constructed, it would have been caught by the logger, and it would have been very clear what the problem was. So my recommendation is always don't do work inside the constructor. Try not to throw exceptions unless it's truly an exceptional thing like a null argument or whatever. So for now, I'm gonna leave this here for the moment, but we're gonna come back to it. When I look at this, there's a bunch of public APIs here. I looked at this earlier, and actually none of these need to be public at this moment. They are all just being called from within the project, or excuse me, within the class. So I'm just going to set these all to private. Here we have a list of SQL to run for the different migrations. So, the initial creation, then we add a column to the users table. Just a super minor note, this doesn't need to be a field level thing. This can actually be private static read only. And looking at this, it's a dictionary where the index type is an integer and it's just 0 and 1. Like, technically this could be a list as well. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to leave it as a dictionary for now. All right. Let's come back to this upgrade thing. So I don't like having this run on upgrade because now that we have database migration being added as a singleton, I don't know. I mean, it depends on your dependency injection, but it's possible nothing will ever request this class, and maybe it never gets created at all, and so suddenly your upgrade never happens. So I'm going to take it out of the constructor, and then this is really the class, the method that matters, so I'm going to make it public. I'm also going to change the name because this doesn't actually do the upgrade. It only does it if it's needed. So we'll call this upgrade if needed. One last thing, this is just a personal preference, is I like to have, if I have an if where the branch, even though this using is technically like one expression, if I have an if where the branch spans multiple lines just visually, I prefer to actually add the brackets. It's not technically necessary, but to me it reads a lot better. It's very confusing to look at the end and just see like a missing parenthesis. It looks like a bug to me, so I'm just going to add that. So this calls upgrade needed. Upgrade needed calls get current database version. So this is a problem too. So we're trying to select star from database version. I know from looking at this earlier that database version is a view that just returns a 1 or a 2 or whatever version. And that's fine. That works well. But what we're doing is we're trying to query that table. And then if the table, if there's any exception, we just return 0. The problem is that there could be other exceptions like the connection is bad or something like that. And so we could be unable to connect to the database, we return 0, and then we keep trying to do stuff. And I would rather just fail at this instant instead of, continuing and then failing later. It's just less confusing, in my opinion. Also, just a minor preference, I don't think we need to have SQL as a separate variable. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this out. We don't want this try-catch. We don't want to catch an exception we can't do anything sensible with. And then the way to actually check if a table exists in MySQL at least the way that worked for me when I was testing this earlier, is to show tables, basically. We'll call this table exist. Query first. And I'm not going to pass a type because I don't actually care what data this thing returns. I just care whether or not there's a row. So I think it's show tables like, and then the table name, which I can see here is database version. And then, so if it does not exist, and actually this should be first or default, my bad. If the table does not exist, then we know it's version 0. Otherwise, we should be able to query the database, get the version, and return that result. Okay, so let's look through this. The upgrade if needed. So we call is upgraded needed, which just calls current version, gets the current version from the database and checks it against the current version. Then we get a connection to the database, and then we call current database version. So then we open another connection. So this is technically working. You know, we're opening a connection, and then we're opening a second connection. But this could actually be a problem if we're using transactions, which we should be using transactions. And so I think we need to correct this. So kind of the quick and dirty way to do this is to create another method that is almost identical, only this one we're going to accept the connection instead of creating the connection. Whoops. And so then in here, we've got this duplicated code. We can actually just return current DB version, passing in that connection. Lastly, again, because I like verbs, I'm going to rename this to get current DB version. Okay. So now is upgrade needed can call this and have its own connection, but in here we can pass in this existing connection so we keep it all on the same connection. Also, I noticed that we have get DB version here. We're calling it here, here, and here. I don't think we need to be constantly calling this. I think we should do this instead. So if the current version is less than, well, I guess this is sort of the expected version. Maybe I'll call this current DB version just to kind of keep them separate. So then we don't need to call it again. Then we try get value. That's another thing I'll come back to. And then we do this. Okay. Okay, so here we're doing try get value on the current version, and then we get SQL. Problem is, if try get value fails, SQL is going to be null, and then we try to execute null. And so instead of getting an error that the key doesn't exist in the dictionary, which would tell us that we're trying to get a version that doesn't exist, we're going to get a null exception on this execute. And so it might be a little harder to reason out what's happening. I think what we need to do is just do this and let this throw the exception if it needs to. I'm a big fan of code that fails quickly and fails loudly. I think if you're going to potentially fail, you should fail as early as you can, and it needs to be visible in some way, whether that's logged to your system, probably not sent to an email, but it needs to be somewhere where people can see it, people other than the end users, where your developers can see it. So I don't mind if this throws an exception, because this is easier to diagnose than the follow-on effects. So we get the SQL out, we execute it. Here's another issue, I think. If any part of this fails, we still update the database version to the next version. So if this failed to, for example, add a column, we still upgrade the database version, and the whole thing just keeps chugging along. If you miss this robot dolphin exception message in the log or on the console, 3 months from now when you get column not found exception, you're going to wonder, where did that column go? Why isn't it there? So because it actually failed sometime in the past, and the exception was just gone. And so in my mind, if any part of this migration fails, there is no sensible way to continue, so it doesn't make sense to have a try catch here. And so I'm going to take it out. I just want this to fail and fail loudly and be done. Okay. So the last thing here is we update this, we update the database, and then we have a couple options. We could, because we're putting, current DB version +1 in here, we could do this, or ++ or however you want to write it. This works. The other thing we could do is just get it again from the database. That's probably like the more technically correct version. So I'm going to just leave it this way, but you could also just, increment current DB version. The last thing I want to do is I mentioned that we should be using transactions, and so I want to do that. In order to use a transaction, I have to open the connection first. Now, the issue here is that if I call this, even though I'm passing in my connection, I also have to pass in my transaction. And so I'm going to add that to my function shape here. Is it IBB transaction? Yeah, transaction. And so we just pass that through to Dapper, and it doesn't like this. I'm going to make it optional. So now this works, and now I can bring my transaction in here and add it to these calls. And then finally, I'd also have to add it here. And here. All right, that's cool. So now we have this upgrade if needed, but there are 0 references to this. So also, I don't know why Bouncy Castle isn't here. There we go. So how do we get this called? Well, I think we need to restructure this a little bit. What I would recommend doing is anytime someone tries to get a connection to the database, we should check and see if it needs to be upgraded one time. So what I mean by that is when someone calls whatever method to get a connection to the database, we check a value. Have we looked to see if the database is up to date? If not, go check and see if it needs to be updated. Once we've checked it once, we can just store a Boolean that says, I've already checked this, so we don't have to go back and check again. And so to make that a little simpler, I'm going to move some of this code out. So we have upgrade if needed. And then I'm going to move this out here. Oh, and I'm not going to make it public. My bad. Into a method that actually does the upgrade. And I'm going to try to keep the formatting the way it currently is, even though Visual Studio is kind of fighting me on this. All right. And so now we've written kind of the equivalent code. But as I mentioned, okay, we need to track, have we done the upgrade yet? And technically, I don't need to assign that, so checked the upgrade. Maybe it should just be like have checked for updates. I don't love that, but naming is hard, so we'll go with it. So basically, if we've checked for updates, then we don't need to do anything else. Otherwise, check to see if it's needed an upgrade. My one issue with this is that it's sort of technically a, not sort of, but it is technically a potential race condition. So you could have a thread that checks, have checked for updates as false. And so then it gets here and the thread gets suspended or something. And then the other thread calls this and then does the upgrade. And then that previous thread gets unsuspended and then tries to do the upgrade again. It probably wouldn't hurt anything, but it's still, there's the potential there. So I'm going to add just a lock object. This is kind of like the laziest way to lock. Whoops, not if. And this is honestly not perfect either, but it's still just a little bit better. And then we could actually check this again here if you really wanted to be thorough. So basically, you know, if the thread gets suspended and then some other thread runs through and then it gets access to the lock, and then it would check it again here just to make sure, oh, some other thread actually did get to this, but while I was waiting for lock access, and so then it bails out. But in this way, in theory, you know, one thread will do the upgrade. There's still some edge cases and stuff that probably should be dealt with, but this is good enough for what we're doing right now. So we still have this upgrade if needed method that nothing is calling. So how do we get that to happen? I would suggest here, instead of returning a connection string, let's return an actual connection. And now the get connection method name actually makes a little more sense. And so we're going to need a reference to database migrations. Right now, database migrations depends on database connection. Database connection cannot also depend on database migration because that obviously makes a loop. So what we can do instead is just accept the connection string as an argument to the constructor. Oops, that needs a this now. There we go. And actually, I'm going to take this out. This does not need to be a getter because it's never referenced. You know, like I would never put logic in there, and so I'm going to replace that with just a field. There we go. And C# Visual Studio helpfully added that to the end of the file for some reason. I'll put it back up at the top where you would expect to see it. So now, because this accepts a connection string, this line isn't going to work anymore, but that's okay. I kind of don't, or excuse me, this line, the database migration, is not going to work anymore, and that's okay. I'm actually going to take this out because I don't necessarily want my dependency injection framework messing with this. Instead, I'm going to make a reference to this on my own. Let's see here. So we'll create a database migration. And again, I'm going to keep this, but I'm going to make it private now. Let's just be explicit and private. Now, if someone calls and wants to get a connection to the database, now I can call upgrade if needed. Most of the time that won't do anything, but the first time you call it will. And then otherwise, we'll just go ahead and create that new database connection. This is client, right? MySQL connection. Get connection string. And then, just as a convenience, I like to open it here and then return it. There we go. So now anything that uses database connection, well, I just broke everything that uses database connection, but every time they go to make a connection to the database, it will do the migration, but only if it's necessary. So let's take a look at what I broke. I think it's all in database service. So we're not going to keep a reference to the connection string anymore. But we are going to keep a reference to connection. So we'll introduce a field for connection. And then all these places where we create this connection will now become get connection. Whoa. Okay. Y'all can't see that, but Visual Studio is helpfully putting a big bunch of text in front of my face, and I can't read what's happening. This should have fixed everything. Nope, not quite. Oh. Oh, so that's where it actually got called originally. Well, we'll just take that out. And also take that out there because we don't need it. Again, that was another one that was happening on the constructor. There we go. All right. I think that's good for database connection, and I think we're good on database migration. Okay, here we are in database service. So we have a thing to get by ID. That looks fine. I mean, we have get by ID, then we just have get. Like, arguably, this could be get by path, just to kind of follow the pattern. This gets it from the path. I don't like, this is totally personal preference, but I like to treat arguments as if they're immutable. It's always weird to me to change an argument, and I think that's because it caused so many problems in other languages that I've worked with where arguments are weirdly global. So it's just maybe just a habit, but I'm going to move that so I'm not actually modifying the path argument. I mean, I'm not modifying the path argument. I'm actually setting it to a new string, but I like to keep whatever passed in. It's just always that, you know. The other thing we could do is, you know, maybe call it like a resolved path or something like that. Maybe we'll do that, and that makes it a lot more clear that we've changed this in some way. Otherwise, that's fine. I think the one thing you might consider is we have query first here. Well, you know, if we really only care about one, you can do top one. I'm not sure if that's the right syntax for MySQL off the top of my head. Maybe it's like I think it's like limit 1, 1 or something like that. But because we're doing query first, we don't actually need to just query star. We could just tell it explicitly we just want one. The other thing you might consider is instead of query first, you could do query single. And actually, I would consider query single or default. So the difference is query first will be accept a list of one or more things and just take the first one. But query single will only take a list of exactly one thing. And so if you've got 5 things that all come back for a certain path, in my mind, that's a bug. A path should be unique. And so I wanted to throw an exception so I know that there was a problem there. And so I also would add or default, because if there's a bot or something, rather than having the database throw an error, I'd rather it just return null, and then like we check for null or something and return a 404 status. So, you know, you really got to think through that a bit, how you want to handle it, but this is my preference. Get all pages. If I remember right, actually is this part of extensions? Yes. I don't know about get all from the extensions, but in Dapper, if you just do like a query and do like select star, you don't have to do .toList by default. By default, it just gives you a list. I don't know about the extensions though. So here we're actually editing some stuff, and I mean, you know, it's fine. If the ID is null, we insert, otherwise we call update. Query first or default from the users. If the user does exist, we set the name and update that. I guess the name is the only thing you can change. Otherwise, we create a user. This is happening a little bit where we're, you know, putting a result into a variable. You know, the compiler is telling me that this is never used, and I could take it out, but this can be useful for debugging sometimes. It makes it easier to see what happened, so I'm just going to leave it for now. And this is actually, I think, an issue. So this is a database service, but we're calling a Google API to validate something. I don't think that should happen inside the database. You know, like to me, get user by token is like doing a select star on a user database and going by token, but this is actually getting the user ID from Google, and then select star from users. Now, do we have user? No, we have page by ID. So we should probably add the get user by token, or by ID, get user by ID. I believe the ID is a string. Okay. So I'm just going to copy all this because mostly I'm just cutting stuff out of it. Don't need this. Don't need any of this. And then I don't need this. Okay. And then the rest of this stuff should probably go into some kind of authentication service. So we'll just call it Authentication Service. Now our Authentication Service, just for simplicity, I'm going to have the Authentication Service call the database service for us. So I will need to take that on as a dependency. Whoops. There we go. Database service. Make that a private read-only field. And now this has to be async. Say, what are we actually doing here? What are we actually doing here? Well, we'll say get user by token. That's fine. And did we call it an auth token? Yes, auth token. And so now we need to get the user. And at this point, I should probably validate Google user is not null or something like that. But, you know, I don't know enough about this API to know what it's actually returning to do that. But I'm going to call database service get user by ID. And then we have the Google user subject. All right, then I can just get rid of all this. Okay. Now I need to tell my dependency injection about this class. And so once again, its only dependencies are things that the dependency injection service understands, and so I don't have to be, I don't have to provide an instance. And actually, because this just accepts service, I'm going to make this transient. And same thing with database service. It doesn't need to be a singleton. I'm going to make it transient. If something accepts dependencies in the constructor and it doesn't need to be a singleton, you should probably make it transient. Because if you make it singleton, you're kind of making all of the dependencies that it takes also singletons. And we've run into issues with that where we had dependencies that were supposed to be transient that were accepted into a class that was set to be singleton. And so those dependencies broke because the requests that they were tied to ended, but we kept a reference to them long after the request was done. So I would recommend, by default, unless you have a reason to, just do not singleton, do transient, okay? And then this looks like it was just some debugging code that got left behind. I'm going to take that out right now. Okay. Let's look at all the stuff that I broke. So now we're in the admin controller, and there are a couple calls to get user by token. So the first thing I notice is that these are private functions with no references, so they're gone. I don't need to fix them because they're not being used. Second, we have this validate user. So how is this being used? We are validating the user at the top of this method and this method. Okay. What does validate user do? It tries to get a cookie, validates them against the authentication service, sets a role, and then checks that the role is okay, and then redirects if it's not and returns a value. I don't think we're using this return value for anything. Yeah, so what could happen is if you're not valid, it decides that you're not. It sets the status 404 and then continues to do the stuff as if you were valid. But I think a better approach to this is actually with an action filter. So let's create our own just like makeshift authentication filter. Okay. Now I can make this an action filter, and it gives me these two methods, the on action executing and on action executed. The problem is that the API that I'm calling, the Google API, is async, and so neither of these are really going to work very well for that. So instead, I think there is an async action filter, which has a slightly different implementation. Now I can still do stuff before the action and after the action. It just depends on when I call the action execution delegate next. That's sort of how I pass on down the chain. So I want to do stuff before. So I'm going to take what we have in here. I'm just going to copy it as is and paste it in here. And I'm going to make this async. And I'm going to bring in a few things. Okay, so role. Now I can't just call request here because I'm no longer in the controller, but I do have this context, and it gives me an HTTP context, which gives me access to request. And so I try to get the cookie out if they have an auth cookie. Now I have a dependency, and that dependency is our authentication service. Now, there is an authentication service in the Microsoft namespaces. That's not the one I want. I want the one that we created, and so I am going to be explicit about that. And we'll make that a private read-only field. That's super ugly, but you know. So one of the things I can do when I have this kind of ugly stuff like this, where there's potentially two authentication services that are sort of in scope according to namespaces, I can just alias one. So I'm going to call this, I hate to say but my authentication service. And then I paste that in. And so now all of this stuff can just be my authentication service. So it's a little weird, but you can do that if you don't like seeing the long stuff there. You can also authenticate, I think, just the namespace. So let's say this, we'll say my services. Again, I hate my, but and we can shorten this up a little bit. There we go. So I'll just leave it like that for now, but those are a couple options if you don't like having fully, fully resolved namespaces. Sorry, fully qualified namespaces. All right, so we are no longer calling the database service. We are now calling authentication service, validating it. And so we have this role. This was originally passed as an argument to our method, but we can't pass things to this. And so we need to accept it as a constructor argument. And I'm going to call it minimum role required, maybe. So this is going to cause us a problem with dependency injection, but we'll fix that in a second. So if the user role is less than the minimum role, once again, we just have to access this here. We say they are not appropriate for the role, and then we return false. We're not returning any booleans here, but I am going to return here. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that I don't call the next basically thing in the chain. But down here, where they do meet the minimum role, I want to keep going. I want to continue this processing. So I'm going to call the next delegate. There we go. So I have this authentication filter, but I can't use it yet because I would have to pass in an authentication service and a minimum role required. And so the workaround for that is to create a factory for this filter. I'm going to call this Authentication Filter Factory, and I'm going to make this one an attribute. What is it? Maybe it's iFilter Factory. Yes. And then we have to implement iFilter Factory. So is this reusable? No, this is not reusable. And then what I can do is in my filter factory, I create an instance of my authentication filter. Now then, I need this, my services.authentication service. Well, I have service provider now, so I can get that. Oh yeah, it's get service, this, there. Now this is actually in a namespace. Let's see if I can remember what the namespace is. I did not remember what the namespace was, but I looked it up. It's Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection. This is just an extension method in that namespace, and for whatever reason, Visual Studio couldn't figure that out. So if I explicitly put this in, it shows up here. So now we have our authentication service. The next thing I need to pass through is the minimum role required. So that I'm going to put on as a, well, there's a couple things. I could either put it on as a constructor argument, which maybe I'll do that, because you probably should, at the very minimum, include that. So I've got that as a constructor argument, and then we pass that through to minimum role required, and then just we return the new filter. So anytime you have an attribute, the compiler wants you to be explicit about how you allow it to be used. So we'll use an attribute usage, and this is valued, we'll say, on properties and classes. So that means I can use this attribute filter factory, authentication filter factory on properties and classes. So in the admin controller, I don't need this anymore. Wherever I was doing that, I can instead do this. And let me bring in that namespace, and I'm expecting role.admin. Oops, I got that wrong. This should not be property. This should be method. So I can put this here, and it will apply to just this property. I could also do it up here, and now you have to be logged in for the entire controller, except I saw that there's a login view, so I don't want to necessarily do that. I'm going to keep it on just these individual methods. Okay, no more validate user. That's looking better. So we have a save user thing here. This should actually probably be in the authentication service as well. There's really no reason to call this validate thing here again. Let's just put that in here. Let's see here. Do I need any result out of this? I don't think I do. Not really. Okay, so now I could potentially, I guess, yeah, I guess everything just comes from the ID token. And I'm just going to grab, not that cookie though, just grab all this stuff. That just works out of the box. That's cool. And so I do need something. I need the email. So that's fine. Now, do I have Authentication Service in here? I do not. And once again, I think I'm going to run into that issue we had before where it's already sort of brought in by a different... Oh, no, it's fine. Notice the database service here is again, we have that getter setter thing. It should probably just be a read-only private field. Super minor, but for consistency. Okay. Oh, doesn't like that. Gotta await that. There we go. All right, since we moved the authentication stuff to a filter, these don't actually need to be async anymore. So you could, if you want to, pull these out and just make them not async. I think it's kind of more down to your preference. But they're not actually doing any async work except for this one. One thing I don't love about this is that we have in the authentication filter, we're getting a cookie. But then in the admin controller, we're setting the cookie. And really, the responsibility for that cookie should exist in one place, and it should probably be the authentication service. So what I'm going to do, I think, is basically we just need to return whether or not the current user is within a certain role. So let's add that here. Not static. So does that need to be async? Yeah, it does. Okay, return a Boolean. Current user is at least this role. This row L. So we're going to take all this stuff back out of here that we just did, paste it in here. Now, one of the things we're not going to have is this context, but we do have HTTP context, which is just HTTP context. Okay, so we can just accept that as an argument. And we'll call that HTTP context and role. And then we don't need to call that from a service because we have it there. Actually, that's a much better variable. I'm just going to take this console thing out. And this needs to return false. This needs to return true. So now, I don't know, is user allowed access this time? So we need to pass in context.htp context and the minimum role required, which is minimum role required. If not, so if they are allowed access, then we continue, and I've forgotten to wait here. There we go. So then finally, where we save user, I think we're going to do the same thing. Just pass along the current context. And like you could probably abstract HTTP context out somehow, and there's a bunch of stuff you could do there, but in the interest of time, I'm going to save the user, and it's going to be HTTP context.response.cookies. Not HTTP, no. There we go. So that removes a lot of stuff from the controller, which is a good thing. Your controllers are really just meant to sort of coordinate between your different services. The actual logic should probably be in services as much as possible. So I think that's looking good. Okay, one last thing. I implied that I wasn't going to fix this, but I thought about it a little bit, and it's going to bother me. I'm probably going to hear about it, so we should fix this. If we're going to do it, might as well do it right. So in the Authentication Service, I have a couple methods where I needed to either read or set cookies or both. And so I just passed along HTTP context to the methods. Arguably, that's not the right thing to do. HTTP context is sort of a dependency of this class. It's going to need cookies in order for it to function. And so you could make an argument that these should not be passed to the method. They should be just part of the dependencies. Luckily, .NET Core kind of has our back in that sense. So .NET Core has a sort of built-in service for this. So what we can do is take a dependency on HTTP context accessor. Try saying that 10 times fast. And so I will do that. I mean, not saying it 10 times fast, but I will take the dependency. And then I'm going to take out this HTTP context here. And what I could do is replace all of these with HTTP context accessor dot HTTP context. Do that. I got to do that in 3 places. Or if I'm feeling lazy, I can just name a variable after what the argument used to be, and then all my other code kind of just works. And so I'm going to do that here. Actually, I'm not going to do that on this one because it's only one place that it actually matters. But either way, it's not a big deal. So once I've done that, now I got to build it and fix all the methods that, or all the references that have now broken. Cool. Okay, now that I've done that, I need to build it and find all the methods that are now broken. I don't need to pass this in anymore. I'm going to run this, and it's going to fail, and we'll talk about why in a moment. So, the exception: some services are not able to be constructed, and the error is on HTTP context accessor because it doesn't know how to resolve that type. So .NET Core, at least in this version of .NET Core out of the box, doesn't know what that type is, and so we need to go into the startup file and add one more thing to the to the services. And there's a built-in extension method to do it. Add HTTP context accessor. There we go. You can't see my browser, but it loaded and gave me the expected 404. So I think that's about it for this one. All right, so we've changed quite a bit of stuff. I looked through some of the rest of the site, and there's not really anything I think worth calling out specifically, but I did want to actually run the site because I'm 100% sure that I've introduced some bugs, and so you won't be able to see the site running, but you will see the exceptions that get thrown, if nothing else. So we're starting up, and the first thing I get is a object not set to a reference. So basically null exception on connection string. So now I got to figure out why is connection string null. So I will stop this. The only place, because connection string is read only, the only place this can get set is in the constructor. So I only have one place I need to check, and that's in the constructor. So let me run this and see what's calling this. I mean, I know what's calling this, but just for the sake of debugging. All right, so I'm stopped here. Connection string is indeed null. The argument is null. Can I do that? This .connection, obviously that's null. So now I can look at my call stack and see that this is getting called from this constructor. And if I look at this, I'm calling configuration, get connection string. Oops. So this is returning the connection string, and then I'm trying to look for a key within configuration string that is the connection string. That's clearly not correct. So that should be that instead. Let's see how that goes. All right, this time I actually started MySQL. Let's see here. Oh, got another null, but this time it makes sense because there's no content in the site. So presumably the migration ran and worked, and it tried to pull a page from the database, but it was not found. So that's actually a thing I can fix. Let's see here. So the first, well, let's look at this. So I wasn't going to look at this one, but I guess I will now because it's a bug. First thing I need to do is get the current page based on the ID. And the ID is actually the path. And then if it's null, is it not found? Yeah, there we go. Otherwise, we can do the rest of this stuff. It's a little, whatever, that's fine. I should at least get a not found now. And you can't see it, but I did. Take my word for it. So the site is at least running, and yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I may come back to this if I get some time to look at it, but this is probably pretty long as it is, so thanks for watching.